I'm Shahar Azani, and in the news, Israel's upcoming general elections. As Israel is gearing towards a fourth round of elections in the last 2 years, political campaigning is at its peak, and so is what seems to be the fragmentation of the Israeli political map. To dig deep into Israel's political quagmire, I'm fortunate to have with us all the way from Israel the perfect person to discuss this complicated feature of the Jewish state, Lahav Harkov. Harkov grew up in New Jersey, making Aliyah at the age of 17, where she did 2 years of national service, Shirut Leumi. She has a degree in political science and communications at Bar-Ilan University. Harkov is currently the senior contributing editor and diplomatic correspondent of the Jerusalem Post. Her responsibilities include reporting on and analyzing Israel's parliament, the Knesset, and Israeli politics. She has interviewed major political figures across the Israeli political spectrum and is very well connected and acquainted with the country's top lawmakers. Lahav is often invited to speak on Israeli government and politics, including on major international news outlets such as the BBC, France 24, and Sky News. And we are now fortunate to have her with us today on JBS. Thank you so much for joining us, Lahav.
Thanks for having me.
So it's great that you're with us, and because of the complexity of the issue, let's just jump right in. I want to ask you, in the last couple of days, we've seen clashes of the Israeli police with the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, significant clashes, such that we have never seen before with the backdrop of the COVID-19 and the quarantine in Israel. How does it affect or connect it to it all with the political campaign and the upcoming March elections?
Well, you would think that it would be a big deal, but it's hard to see the parties sort of taking advantage of the situation. So I'll just, I guess, back up a little bit. There's sort of widespread defiance of the coronavirus lockdown in certain sectors of the Haredi community, especially certain Hasidic courts or certain Hasidic sects, and they're opening up their schools. And so the police came in and there really was police brutality, but on the other hand, the Haredim were truly, behaving violently in response. And it was just really terrible clashes, as you said. The way I think that this might come through in the election is that at this point, the rising COVID-19 cases are coming disproportionately from the Haredi community. They're only about 10% of Israelis, but they show up far more. In the town of Bnei Brak, which is predominantly Haredi, 1 in 5 coronavirus tests comes back positive. And a lot of them are opening up their schools, whereas the rest of the country, secular, religious Zionist, Arab, the schools are closed. And it surprises me to some extent that at least the parties on the left and the center left aren't capitalizing on the frustration that I see all over from people who are not Haredi, that, we are in a lockdown and we might have to go into another lockdown, not because of the actions of the majority of Israelis, but because of specific communities. And I see the frustration among some Haredim too, those who are law abiding, they're not happy that their sort of name is being sullied by other groups.
Are these clashes something new? I mean, or has it happened throughout the last year of COVID-19 and quarantines in Israel?
This is the most extreme. There have been a lot of incidences that have come up in the news of Haredim not obeying the COVID-19 rules. There's been large weddings, large holiday gatherings. We're talking about hundreds or even thousands of people. With a very little police action to break them up. So as far as clashes between police and Haredim, there's a very long history in Israel going back many decades of these kinds of things happening, whether it's about protesting against laws that might require them to enlist in the IDF or about public violations of the Sabbath if we go even further back.
But here we are, weeks before the elections. The Haredis, the ultra-Orthodox, have always been part of Netanyahu's famous block of governance, his hope for a 60-plus government in the next elections. Do you think these clashes have any chance of eroding some of the Haredi support for Benjamin Netanyahu and Likud?
Overall, the Haredim are being treated with kid gloves. The enforcement, there was a investigative report just a few days ago in Israel that showed that even though there are violations and a large number of COVID-19 cases, the number of tickets being given out is actually very low. So I wouldn't. I think that Netanyahu and his coalition are being very careful about the political implications here. Which is not fair. The pandemic doesn't know who's in the coalition and the opposition. It's just contagious. And I'm not trying to pin this on the Haredi population. We've had messes in government. We've had inconsistent policies for almost a year now. But at the moment, there are some serious things going on.
At this point in time, it seems that Netanyahu and his Likud party continue to go up in the polls as the vaccination operation moves forward. So do these two go hand in hand, the vaccination and Netanyahu's chances of winning the elections?
Yeah, I mean, Netanyahu in some ways has been lucky and in some ways is just very, very skilled politically. This policy of lockdowns of opening and closing and closing and opening is clearly not that effective in stopping the pandemic, right? On the other hand, very little has been affected worldwide. In that way, you can't necessarily blame him. But obviously, the effectiveness would be greater if there was greater enforcement in hotspots. At the same time, Netanyahu sort of put all of his chips on the side of the vaccines. Israel is paying a premium to get the vaccines first and also giving data to Pfizer. So we're sort of the experiment, the sort of test ground for the vaccines, which most people, including myself, are not upset about. I mean, these vaccines have been properly tested and, if Pfizer wants to see how it works on our population, it certainly doesn't bother me. But in that way, Netanyahu has been very successful because we have the highest rate of vaccination in the world. Our health funds.
The Israeli public is giving him the credit for the vaccines.
Yes, the Israeli public is definitely giving him credit for the vaccines. It must be said, we also have very wonderful and efficient health services going back decades now that have also helped with this. But Netanyahu certainly personally was involved in making sure Israel got vaccines quickly. And so, yeah, as you said, his numbers are rising in the polls. And Netanyahu himself certainly sees this, Israelis being vaccinated and being able to come out of lockdown as his ticket to winning this election. I think it's possible. I do think it's possible.
But beyond COVID-19 and its successes and failures, which I'm sure exist anywhere, you recently published in the Jerusalem Post that the Security Cabinet has not met in weeks to discuss Iran and other security matters, including the Biden administration. There is great criticism also of Israel going without a budget since March of 2018. That's 2 years in such critical time. Does it have any kind of effect on the public perception of the prime minister?
Well, it's strange. Look, the Netanyahu has been a sort of a solo artist for several years now, but especially in the last 2 years or so, the number of people he trusts has gotten smaller and smaller, and he makes more and more decisions on his own without convening the cabinet, without convening the security cabinet, which by law he's really supposed to consult with on matters of life and death, on security and major security and diplomatic issues. It makes it difficult for the government to function properly as a whole. On the other hand, he's pulled enough rabbits out of his hats. He is talented enough on his own that he has managed to do a lot of things very well. And so people are more focused on the bottom line than the process, at least the people who tend to support him, whereas the people who oppose him tend to highlight these things more. and say that it sort of goes hand in hand with the corruption accusations against him, sort of that he doesn't respect the rule of law and the process that comes in a democracy. And I think in some ways both things are true. He clearly does not respect the process and thinks that he can do things on his own better than he can by bringing together a lot of elected officials instead of just himself. And at the same time, he clearly is very talented and does manage to get a lot done by himself. So voters in the end prioritize.
We're talking about the elections and victory. So just for the sake of our viewers who want to tap into this great expertise of yours, let's talk about the meaning of victory. Does it only depend on the Likud emerging as the largest party in the elections? Or could it be that even though Likud is the largest party emerging out of the elections, Netanyahu will not be given the mandate by the president to create the next coalition government?
So the law in Israel doesn't require the government to be formed by the head of the largest party. And the president, Reuven Rivlin, has said many times that his role is to give the mandate to form the next government to whoever has the most recommendations. So the process is that after the election, after the votes are certified, the parties go and meet with Rivlin, representatives of each party go, and they tell Rivlin who they recommend as prime minister. And Rivlin tallies up those numbers of how many seats each party is worth and who got how many recommendations. And whoever has the most gets to form the next government. And it has happened a couple of times in the past already, including in the last 2 years, that the person that does not have the most seats still has the most recommendations and gets the first shot at forming a coalition. So looking at the polls now, the sort of pro-Netanyahu camp and the anti-Netanyahu camp, which do not really correspond to left and right so neatly, they're neck and neck. And the problem, I guess, for the anti-Netanyahu camp is that it includes the Joint List, which is the bloc of Arab parties. They're non-Zionist parties. They're opposed to Israel being the state of the Jewish people. And some of them at least support very extremist elements among the Palestinians. And so it's hard to build a majority coalition with people who are willing to sit together with parties that hold such extreme positions. So the left or the anti-Netanyahu camp, which also includes some on the right these days, is at a built-in disadvantage numerically.
And we've also seen Netanyahu venturing into Nazareth and Al-Fahim, trying to find those votes, right? That's been very interesting.
Yeah, so Netanyahu has tapped into something that's been going on in the Arab public in the past year and a half or so, which is frustration with the Joint List. They've come to realize that the Joint List is not going to be able to be in a government with the other parties, with the Zionist parties, and be in a position of influence. And so some percentage of the Arab public is frustrated with that and is looking for other parties to vote for. And Netanyahu is trying to tap into that. He's campaigning in Arab towns. Polling shows that Likud's numbers are going up partly because of Arab voters. So we'll see if that's able to last through March.
Well, think what we want about Netanyahu's successes and failures. He's definitely an out-of-the-box thinker, either outreach to the Arab sector or finding him on TikTok, where I'm hearing about 10-year-old kids watching his videos.
Yeah.
Now, I want to talk to you about Netanyahu's indictments. We heard so much about those in the past couple of election campaigns, and his trial is supposed to go on or is going on, resuming, I believe, on February 8th or supposed to resume.
Yeah.
What part does this even play in these elections? Are we hearing less about this? I know it mattered in the past. Does it still matter to the Israeli public?
In some way, it sort of never mattered, I would say. I know why you say it mattered in the past, because there have been mass protests against Netanyahu. The largest of which were tens of thousands of people, but there's been a consistent sort of few thousand protesters for a couple of years now. But polling wise, it almost never really mattered. Even the day after his indictment was announced, the next polls, there was barely a drop, and they went right back up again afterwards. And now in this election, it's sort of as if people have forgotten. I think that people have like metastasized into their specific positions and they're not really moving. There is some movement, right? Because Gidon Sa'ar from the Likud party has left and formed his own party, which is sort of like Likud without Netanyahu. It's full of people who used to be in Likud or who used to work for Netanyahu and work very closely with Netanyahu, who have said that his political positions are good, but he himself has become too corrupt, and that's a problem, that it's sort of corrupting Israeli democracy. So there is some movement on that front, and I would say that these indictments are sort of the reason why there's this breakaway right-wing party and sort of why there's some chance that Netanyahu could lose the election, even though I still think he's at an advantage these days. But as far as like February and the court date, I'll be very surprised if there's some sort of big movements in the polls because of his court date, since there was nothing when he was indicted.
You know, interestingly enough, for our viewers in New York, one of those people who joined Gidon Sa'ar's party, New Hope, Tikva Hadasha, is none other than the former consul general in New York, Dani Dayan, who also jumped ship, who was appointed by Netanyahu and joined Gidon Sa'ar. Did that surprise you, Lahav?
Yes and no. Dani Dayan is very talented. I think he did a great job as consul general. He has been a little bit of a political traveler. He's always been on the right, but he once ran in the primaries for the Bayit Yehudi party, which is sort of the far right. And then he supported Netanyahu. He endorsed Netanyahu and Likud. And so now he's endorsing another right-wing party. So, there's a lot of positive things about him. And I also don't think people necessarily have to be wedded to one party anyway. But he's not someone of great party loyalty that it surprised me so much.
Definitely that's the case in Israel. And definitely,
right.
I'm just wondering, in your view, what is the main threat? If you're the prime minister and you're sitting now looking ahead, what do you fear the most that may hamper your chance of winning the election?
Okay, when you finished that question differently than you started. You said, what's the main threat? It's always Iran with Netanyahu. But for the election, I think Netanyahu sees Gidon Sa'ar as the main threat because he is the second most popular person in the polls. After Likud comes Gidon Sa'ar's New Hope party. Now, New Hope has been dropping, Likud's been rising. They have maybe a little more than half the votes Likud has. So they're not a huge threat, but the real threat is that the entire bloc that is against Netanyahu will be big enough that Sa'ar will be able to form a coalition first. And Sa'ar is on good terms with the Haredi parties, the ultra-Orthodox parties that have really been in Netanyahu's pocket for over a decade at this point. So I think the threat is that if Sa'ar gets strong enough, even if his party's not bigger than Likud, he'll be able to attract the ultra-Orthodox parties to join his coalition instead of one led by Netanyahu.
So Sa'ar for sure is positioned as right. But if I'm an alien just arriving in the state of Israel and I'm looking at Netanyahu as a political leader, I'm seeing someone who signed peace accords with the Arab world, who is reaching out to the Arab-Israeli public, who has canceled his intent to annex part of the West Bank. So I think that, is it right to assume or see that Netanyahu is veering more to the center, maybe even center-left?
Up until you got to the part about sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, I would say that those are positions that are common to right and left in Israel. Everyone wants peace with the Arab world and peace with our neighbors, with the Palestinians. It's a question of the terms. And Netanyahu got that with very little sacrifice for Israel. So there's no reason that the right wing would not support the Abraham Accords. Now,
and yet settler leaders were very upset with him when he didn't move on applying sovereignty in the West Bank.
Correct. Now that was, look, I could talk about this probably for half an hour, but it seemed like that wasn't a very strong possibility even before we knew about the Abraham Accords. The blue and white in the coalition had sort of successfully conveyed to the Trump administration that this is something that they think shouldn't happen. The Trump administration was no longer pushing it, even though it was their own peace plan. They were a lot more hesitant about it. And Netanyahu also was not very decisively moving forward. And hindsight's 2020, we realized at a certain point, They probably knew that they could move forward with the UAE and decide to do that instead. But I definitely push back against the notion that wanting peace and also reaching out to Israeli Arabs could not be a right-wing thing. We know that Menachem Begin, who was the first prime minister from Likud, made peace with Egypt. And he was also a warrior for minority rights in Israel. As someone who was in the opposition for 29 years before becoming prime minister, he sensed what that was like. He truly understood at least the political experience of being a minority, although I think socially too, because of the way things were in the early years of the state. And so he also, it was very important to him that the minorities in Israel have rights. So it's not necessarily right-wing, left-wing.
But listening to you, it even leads us to think or see that the people who really are able to make such moves are leaders of the right, because we've seen right before the forming of this government that we had two members of Blue and White who refused to engage with the joint Arab list, whereas Netanyahu was happy to jump into bed with some members of that list to pursue his political goals. So maybe that's indeed the case, from Begin to Netanyahu. There
is a cliche in Israel, sort of, that only the right wing can get away with giving up land, right? It's also Ariel Sharon, who came from the right, who gave up Gaza. I think that your follow-up it's a little more complicated than that, because the two people from Blue and White who refused to sit with the joint list are people who really come from the right. You know, Blue and White was this sort of disjointed mishmash of several parties that came from a very broad political spectrum, and they were probably the furthest to the right of anyone in Blue and White.
Let me just pick up on this point for a minute. Because my question leads exactly to this topic. We're looking at the elections, and usually it's some, head-to-head, two candidates. But this time the opposition is fragmented. We have so many parties. We have Gantz still in the political game. We have Gidon Sa'ar. We have the Tel Aviv mayor, Huldai. We have Yair Lapid, of course. Even Moshe Bogi Ya'alon is there, and some others, not to mention Labour Party. Do you think a major contender may emerge by next week, February 4th, when the lists are closed for the election? Someone the entire camp may rally around to support, like Gantz used to be in the past three elections? Or where are we headed in this context?
At this point, the person most likely and most able to challenge Netanyahu is Gidon Sa'ar, and he is very solidly right-wing. And always has been. He's a little bit more socially liberal in some ways, but really solidly right-wing on the issues that most Israelis care about. And so a lot of the people who sort of rallied behind Gantz are not going to go to Sa'ar because they don't identify as right-wing, right? There is a core of sort of centrists who oppose Netanyahu, who are able to migrate sort of a little right, a little left, and some of them have clearly gone to Sa'ar. But not an overwhelming amount that, brings him neck and neck with Netanyahu the way Blue and White had been. So really the parties other than Likud and, the Haredim, who are sort of in the same condition they've always been, they really are very sort of fragmented.
There are those who claim that Naftali Bennett, the head of Yamina, may end up as the kingmaker after these elections, having enough power to determine whether to create a government with Netanyahu and the ultra-Orthodox or create a government with the anti-Netanyahu faction. Is this your feeling as well? And if so, which way do you think he's actually going to take eventually?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very possible that Naftali Bennett will find himself in that role. And it's actually really hard for me to guess what he's going to do, because he has, ever since entering politics, he's had a very fraught relationship with Netanyahu. And yet he goes back to Netanyahu's coalition every time because his voters are right-wing and his voters want him to go to Netanyahu. This time around, he's been much tougher on Netanyahu, much more critical, but still not willing to say that he won't sit in a coalition with Netanyahu, as opposed to Sa'ar, and it's a very important distinction. And so I'm really not sure what Bennett will do. Part of him acts like he's had it; it's enough. He's not going to work with Netanyahu anymore. But part of him clearly maybe is afraid to take that step, or maybe is probably, because he's a politician, is basing it on whatever polls he has that says that if he goes full on against Netanyahu, he'll lose votes. So I don't have a solid prediction here. I think it'll be very interesting to see.
Very interesting to see, possibly even determining the chances of Bennett himself to be prime minister in some sort of a coalition agreement.
Maybe. I think that after the experience of the last year, everyone's kind of turned off by rotation governments, but maybe he could be defense minister, which is what he really wants.
Right, like he was before.
Briefly, yes.
Briefly, yeah, and wrote a book. Was before and wrote
right.
A book, right?
Well, the book was about coronavirus.
Right, and his role as how he was able to. I wanted to ask you about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court touched upon the issue of a prime minister with criminal indictments. Do you think there is any chance that the prime minister may face hinder from that direction as far as being able to establish a government, or potentially looking into the submarine or any other element that may interfere?
So thus far, the Supreme Court has stopped just short of not allowing Netanyahu to form a government. But Israel's Supreme Court is highly activist, sets new precedents very often on how far it can go in intervening in the executive and legislative branches of government. And I wouldn't put it past them. I think some of the reason that they've been cautious not to cross that sort of last line is because they realize that they've become a very controversial institution in Israel, and that many people view the courts as politicized in Israel, and they need to find a way to maintain their legitimacy. I think that would be sort of crossing a final line that many people, and not just people who are in the tank for Netanyahu, even Gideon Sa'ar thinks the courts are too activist. Many of these people might really feel that the court has crossed the line and that laws need to be passed in the Knesset to rein it in.
That's an incredible complexity you're dealing with, Lahav. So many different elements pulling in each direction, with the result being so different each time. I want to ask you one last question before we say a quick goodbye. But the Biden administration has just come into power here in the U.S. We know that Netanyahu's relationship with President Trump and, of course, Jared Kushner and others have been very close. The question is, Biden coming into office, is that an advantage for Netanyahu in this election campaign, or a disadvantage?
I think it's a disadvantage. I think Netanyahu had such an advantage with Trump, and everyone saw it. And Netanyahu knew how to sort of make himself the victim with Obama. And I'm not saying that it's fake. I mean, to some extent, justifiably, like Netanyahu did not get along. Obama had policies that many Israelis viewed as not good for Israel. But with Biden, it's too early for Netanyahu to, quote unquote, play the victim card in that way. So I think that it's only going to be like, oh, now there's an American president that, is just not as friendly with Netanyahu. So maybe we can consider a different prime minister. Maybe it doesn't matter as much as Netanyahu is there. Netanyahu, however, has been emphasizing that he's known Biden since the 80s. They have a long relationship, and et cetera, et cetera. And Biden himself, he says that he would say this all the time at like events. Whenever he'd go to Jewish events, he would say, Bibi, I love you, but I don't agree with a damn thing you say. And you can find that clip like on YouTube. So if Netanyahu needs it, I'm sure he'll take out the Bibi, I love you, and cut the I don't agree with the thing you say.
and to the Israeli public, Bibi will be masterful enough to say, if anybody can handle the Biden administration, you need an experienced premier who showed you how he can withstand international pressure. Isn't that the case, Lahav?
I'm sure.
Well, I just want to say a big thank you to you, Lahav, for your thoughts and incredible insights on this important issue. And I look forward to speaking to you soon and having you again on JBS.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. And to all we say, stay safe and stay healthy. I'd like to thank our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS's managing director, Dara Golob, our technical manager, Michael Paley, transmission manager, John McDevitt, and to our wonderful producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. For JBS, I'm Shahar Azani. Until next time, see you soon. Shalom and lehitraot.